There are two types of immigrants. There are permanent immigrants and migrant immigrants. Permanent immigrants don't plan to go back to their home country, and they don't send money back. Migrant immigrants just come to a country for an economic gain, and they send money home, and then eventually they plan to go home. There are two groups of immigrants that we focus on. There are the old immigrants who came between 1860 and 1890. They were from Northern and Western Europe. There were about 10 million immigrants in the old immigrant category, and they had a lot of similarities with people already in the U.S. For instance, most U.S. citizens had European heritage, most were Protestant, and most of the immigrants were Protestant, except for the Irish Catholics, who are still Christian. There was a high literacy rate, and they believed in democracy because most of them came from representative constitution-based governments. They were permanent immigrants, and between being permanent immigrants and having all of those similarities, it was easier for them to assimilate than the new immigrants. And they were actually interested in assimilating because they were going to stay here. The newer immigrants, however, came from between 1890 and 1920. They were from Southern and Eastern Europe, which is mostly Slavic countries and Italy. There were about 15 million new immigrants, and they had a lot of differences from the people already in the U.S. They had Orthodox religions, such as Judaism. Most of them were illiterate. They didn't speak English, and their politics were a lot different. They were coming from monarchies and autocracies and anarchies and socialist governments. More of the immigrants than the old immigrants were just migrant immigrants. It still wasn't the majority, but there were more of them. And they weren't really interested in social mobility because they were migrant immigrants. I mean, they were just interested in the money. They didn't really care about social statuses. So they were willing to work jobs others weren't, and they just wanted a simple job to make easy money to send home to their countries. There are two reasons for immigration. You've got push factors and pull factors. Push factors are when where you are is just terrible, and so you have to leave, such as persecution, economic problems, or when a natural disaster occurs. Pull factors are when it's better elsewhere. The U.S. had four major pull factors. You've got job opportunities for economic gains, social mobility, freedom and democracy, especially for the new immigrants who weren't used to that, and education. There were a lot of push factors as well. Industrialization increased the population, which led to an increase in pollution, poverty, and crime. There were a decrease in job opportunities. There was a decrease in land. Modern medicine was making people live longer and increasing the population, which leads to competition and less space. There were natural disasters, and in the 1870s, the Italian government really didn't care about poverty. So poverty and natural disasters pushed the Italians, and anti-Semitism was a big factor for the Jews. There were three factors that were both push and pull factors, including in the late 1800s, serfdom was gotten rid of. The means to get here was better. It took as little as 5.5 days, so the time and money decreased, time and cost, and the cost was about $8. The Chinese population was getting so high that the Chinese government was actually encouraging people to immigrate to the United States. There are consequences to immigration. Positive consequences include cheap labor, and that cheap labor was used to expand, and progression. There are also negative consequences, including social tension and bigotry, an increase in population, an increase in poverty, and an increase in crime. Native-born U.S. people had a lot of animosity towards the immigrants, and even the old immigrants discriminated against the new immigrants. People got rich using the immigrant labor. That's actually how the Transcontinental Railroad was built. There were also several cases of internal migration, or immigration. People went from rural areas to urban areas. The Great Migration occurred, and blacks went north, and ghettos were formed, and those were immigrant pockets within cities. They stuck together because they weren't accepted elsewhere, and it served as protection. But the natives saw it as being unwilling to assimilate. The natives saw opposites in the immigrants, which led to negativity and resentment. Differences were considered inferiorities. For instance, if you were a teacher, you saw illiteracy. Public opinion leads to public policy, so the anti-immigrant public led to anti-immigrant legislation. There were several reasons for prejudice, but you can really trace it down to this. Simple solutions to complex problems lead to prejudices. In the 1890s, the immigrants were used as the scapegoat for the Depression. The justification for the animosity towards the immigrants includes, in 1891, the Hennessy case. In New Orleans, there were two immigrant brothers named Dave and Pete Provenzano. They were accused of involvement in gang-related wars and attempting to actually massacre the other gang. Hennessy was the superintendent of the police department of New Orleans, and he said that he had info that the mafia was behind all of these wars. And when he said that, he was shot and killed. And just before dying, he said, "The Italians got me." Joseph Shakespeare was the mayor of New Orleans, and he ordered the police department to arrest all Italians. They found 11 Sicilians. They put them on trial. The jury said that they weren't guilty, so the natives were upset, and a mob tracked down the 11 and killed them. The Provenzanos were later found innocent. In 1901, on September 6th in Buffalo, New York, William McKinley, the president, was assassinated during press photos by Leon Czolgosz, a self-proclaimed anarchist. Czolgosz's parents were immigrants, but he was born in the U.S. But his last name made the public assume that he was an immigrant, and that reinforced that the immigrants were bad and not assimilating. And you don't get much farther from assimilating than killing the president. In 1914, Leo Frank, a Jewish man, went from New York to Atlanta. So not only was he Jewish, but he was also a northerner, so those things weren't accepted. He managed a pencil factory. A girl named Mary Fagan was found murdered in his factory, and Frank was accused because he was different. He was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. This made international news. The governor commuted the sentence to life in prison because of the pressure of being on the international news, but that made the public angry, and a mob from Mary Fagan's hometown broke into the prison and dragged Frank out of the cell, drove across state lines, and killed him. In 1980, new evidence emerged that found Leo Frank innocent. The last example occurred in 1868 with the Transcontinental Railroad. In the 1870s, the Chinese workers entered the job market. They were the main workers on the Transcontinental Railroad. And in the 1870s, a depression hit, so it must be the Chinese workers' fault. In 1882, a Chinese Exclusion Act was passed that said that no Chinese immigrants could be let in for 10 years, and it limited the rights of the Chinese immigrants that were already here. In 1892, they extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years, and in 1896, Henry Cabot Lodge proposed a literacy test for the immigrants. It was vetoed, but still. In 1902, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed indefinitely, or extended indefinitely. In 1916, there was a dislike for immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe because the U.S. got involved in World War I against the Central Powers. In 1917, Russia was getting its butt kicked, but the Tsar kept fighting because he wanted land. The Bolshevik Revolution occurred, and Russia rebelled against it and killed its Tsar. This led to communism, which benefits those who don't have it as much. We'll call those the have-nots. The U.S. was scared that the U.S. have-nots will see this and try to make the U.S. communist. The correlation between people from that part of the world and communism led to fear of those people in the U.S. In 1921, an Emergency Quota Act was passed that said that no more than 3% of any nationality in the U.S. in 1910 could annually immigrate to the United States. In 1924, the National Origins Act was passed, which lowered the 3% to 2% and made the year 1890 rather than 1910 because the Emergency Quota Act wasn't doing enough. This targeted the new immigrants. There are 4 ideological currents. There's nativism, social Darwinism, manifest destiny, and progressivism.